for a child, there really isn't that sort of idea, well, it'll all better go away and we'll be back again. A child's fear is that it's gone forever. October the 7th made clear many, many things. And one of the most important aspects of the effect of October 7th has been to expose and explain what it means to have a moral position.
Welcome to an episode of This Is Not a Watermelon. My name is Mikey Mhenna. We're recording this episode on July 25th, and today we're lucky enough to be joined by Dr. Ghada Karmi, who is a Palestinian-born academic, physician, and author who has authored many books and articles. It is an absolute honor to be welcoming you, Doctora. Thank you so much.
Hello, you too.
I became first aware of your work when I came across your book, your most recent book, I have to say, One State, which we're going to get to in a few minutes. But maybe a good place to start is the first two words of how I introduced you, which is Palestinian born. I'd love to go back in time to where you grew up, and I'd love to learn a little bit about your childhood and being born in Jerusalem, what you remember of those days and what your childhood was like.
Well, as you can imagine, I was born before 1948, but not long before 1948. So my memories are not as good as they could be. And I didn't grow up in Jerusalem, unfortunately. I grew up in London. But I started life certainly in Jerusalem. And as a child, I imagine that I thought, well, I didn't think much about where I was. I assumed that's where I would go on being. And so it would have been, had it not been for the establishment of the State of Israel in May 1948, I and hundreds of thousands of other Palestinians would have stayed in our home country and would have just grown up and led, I suppose, ordinary lives. But that wasn't going to happen. So I had a frightening childhood because by the time that I was around and aware, there were a sort of low-grade war between the Jewish militias and between Palestinian fighters in Palestine. Now, the Jewish militias were on a path to expel the Palestinians and take our country for themselves. And many people couldn't really believe that. Vaguely, I suppose, Jerusalem, 1940s, some people were aware of what the intention was on the part of the Jewish leadership. But many people, ordinary people like my family, did not really believe it would happen.
Yeah.
They knew that it was possible. That's what the Jews were aiming for. Because remember, I'm using the word Jews properly, because before 1948, that's what they were called, Jews. It was only from 1948 that they became Israelis. And then everybody got themselves tied up in knots as to whether you use the word Jew and whether you could be accused of anti-Semitism, all this business. But that wasn't like that at the time.
Yeah, I was talking about this very point in a previous episode and really wondering about the Jewish community in Palestine, I mean, Palestinian Jews at the time, if they felt like they were being lumped in to this group of Europeans, basically, and saying, we're not like these people who are coming here. Did you, I mean, you were a baby at the time, you were young at the time, but did you have a sense that there was this cognitive dissonance at the time?
Yes. Look, there was a Jewish community in Palestine. It was an indigenous, we used to call them, in fact, Arab Jews or our Jews, because they were Arabs, really, with a Jewish religion. So that community was very alarmed by the appearance of these Europeans, obviously intent on colonizing the country, and they didn't like them. They felt that they were alien, just in the same way as we felt those European settlers were alien. So really, the story, by the way, of the Arab Jews has yet to be written.
100%.
I mean, there have been, there have been some research and some writings, but it's a poignant story, actually, what happened to the indigenous Jews. Anyway, so that's how, yes, we were aware that they were as uneasy as we were.
Yeah. So when your family left Jerusalem or left Palestine to go to Damascus in 1948, was there a sense of we're going for a few months and we're coming back? Or was there a sense immediately that the danger was grave and that the damage may be lasting?
No, not at all. The people, our family included, were convinced that we were leaving on a temporary basis because it was dangerous, because there were too much shooting, and there was a real danger for children, and families couldn't stay around. But everybody was convinced that we were all going home again. It was a temporary absence until, quote, things settled down, unquote. No, there was no possible. I don't believe there were any Palestinians who could have imagined that we would stay out for good.
Yeah. Do you ever think back to those moments? Do you find yourself reliving that stretch of time?
No, I don't. And I tell you, something very odd happened to me. And I, many years later, look back, and I think I actually quite understand, I can explain. First of all, I don't have clear enough memories, which I should have had, because I wasn't a young infant. And I was below the age of 10, but it doesn't mean that I had no awareness. I did. The memories that I have are hazy, and they are overladen with a fog of memory, which is not an accident. I am quite certain in my own mind that my poor memory is to do with the fact that I've suppressed all those events. Obviously, I remember some things, and I remember snatches of things very vividly, but I think my failure to be able to recall things in the way that a child of my age would have been able to is to do with the trauma of our departure from Palestine. It showed itself in different ways according to your age, your generation, who you were, what you were doing. But there's no question that expulsion in 1948, which, remember, for a child, there really isn't that sort of idea of, well, it's all going to go away and we'll be back again. A child's fear is that it's gone forever. And you know how children, when they can't see their mothers for a bit, get into a panic because they get an idea that they will never see their mother again. And it's something like that. So for me, I suppose, that departure abrupt, I was not prepared. My parents never prepared us. They themselves, poor things, were unprepared. But that departure, as I say, abrupt as it was, shocking as it was, had a profound effect on me. And I think it made me suppress the memories. They're too painful.
I can completely understand that. And I think that there's a generation of writers and thinkers and sort of public intellectuals who also clearly have that blockage where it's too hard to access those memories. I want to ask you a question that's very clearly, this is going to be a personal question. And it's based off something that I read about your life. And maybe this is a little too personal and you can tell me if it is, but I read online that you were married and then after 1967, your marriage ended because of a irreconcilable dispute about your husband, your then husband, being pro-Israeli in that exact moment. My question to you is, what advice do you give people of my generation or different generations who say, you know, after October 7th, there are some people in my life who are quite frankly not vocally in support of Palestine, not vocally anti-Zionist, and I don't know what to do about it. Some of them are family members, some of them are colleagues, some of them are friends, some of them are significant others. What is your advice to these people?
I might shock you if I tell you that after October 7th, which is much worse than the 1967 war, as far as the Palestinians are concerned, although that was bad enough, after October 7th, my opinion on people who express any kind of support for Israel, or people who are neutral and say, well, I don't know about it. It could be this, it could be that. It's probably a bit of this and a bit of that. I'm sorry to tell you, all those people have to be removed from one's life. And of course, I don't mean killed, but I mean you have no further business with people like this. And I say that without any equivocation. October the 7th made clear many things. And one of the most important aspects of the effect of October 7th has been to expose and explain what it means to have a moral position. Now, we're not talking about people who've been directly affected, where their families have been killed. I'm talking about people who were not involved like that, but could see what was happening on their screens. People who remained either unaffected or on Israel's side or not knowing which side to be on are people without a moral sense. And I really mean that. Now, I don't want to deal with people who have no moral sense. I don't have anything in common with them, and I'm not interested in anything that they have to say on issues which are really very important. And so I'm sorry to be so hardline, but there are no excuses here. And this is not a question of either hesitation, wondering what's the right thing to do, but rather doing the right thing. Now, I understand very well that people may not know enough and they may want to have more information. That I can understand. Who might say, well, how did this all start? Why are we here? Why is Israel behaving like this? This I understand. But people who actually can see what Israel is doing and cannot see that there is no justification on earth for a military to attack and kill small children, people who cannot actually see that is wrong are not people I want to have anything to do with.
Have you ever wavered from this position? Have you ever thought to yourself, well, maybe I have to sort of hold some people's hands and bring them along? Over the course of your career in public life and thinking about this, have you ever wavered? Have you ever found yourself thinking, well, this person has moral clarity on so many other issues, but this one, seems to be a blind spot?
Not
really.
I know what you're getting at. I know what you're getting at. I think that probably previously, when things haven't been really so clear-cut, I suppose I've tried to see another side. I even tried to force myself to consider overtures from what I would call soft Zionists, people who say, we really do feel with you, we don't want you to suffer, we want Palestinians to have their own state, but please let us have our own and you have your own, and let's be friends. I have considered at some time in my life that perhaps that is a point of view which doesn't stem from some kind of evil, but stems from, I suppose, a desire on the part of people who very much want something to happen for them, but also feel badly that it should affect other people. And from that perspective, I suppose I could say yes. But, generally speaking, I've never been able to be soft on any kind of Zionism, really. And I don't see how any Palestinian could possibly accommodate Zionists at all, because their aim is to get to keep my country. They not only took it, but they want to keep it. So how on earth am I supposed to get on with them?
I'm going to read the name of an article that you wrote, and it's entitled "Zionism is Still the Issue." And it's an article that you wrote in 2004, 20 years ago. And obviously Zionism is still the issue 20 years later. And I'm sure that you could, in theory, copy paste that article and republish it today with the same argument. So my question to you is, over the course of your career, have you found words to be a useful medium to convince people what the issue is?
Without question. Without question. Words have been sharper than swords, more impactful than bombs, no question at all. And the best example of that in my own life is my memoir, In Search of Fatima. Now, I say that because when I thought about writing it, this was at the end of the 1990s, I can remember that I took a very cool and rational decision. I didn't rush into writing my memoir because I had a nostalgia and a yearning for recapturing the past, although later that did happen as I was writing it. No, the initial was that I was puzzled as to how it was that after years and decades of campaigning on behalf of the Palestinian cause, so little had been achieved. I found it extraordinary. I couldn't explain it. And then it came to me that the parallel with the Holocaust, meaning that the Holocaust is so well known, school children in Britain know it. Everybody knows it. And then I asked myself, how is that? Well, it's not because those school children were looking up world history or triple United Nations papers or any of that. Of course, it was clear to me. They knew it because Jewish survivors were writing about their personal experiences. They wrote stories, they wrote plays, they made films. In other words, the personal story of this horrible event, the Holocaust, was being conveyed in a way that people could identify with and could understand. And my next thought was, why the hell aren't we doing the same? We Palestinians, we have our own story. We don't need to be always referring to UN resolutions, political analysis. How about a story? And that's actually how I began In Search of Fatima. Now, I must honestly tell you, in terms of the power of words, honestly, for years I campaigned for Palestine. Within a year of publication of this memoir, I had gained more supporters for Palestine, more sympathizers, more people writing to me saying how sorry they were than I had in decades of campaigning. Proved to me that the story, the power of words to describe personal experiences is unrivaled.
Yeah, so if that's true, do you feel a step change from 2004 to now? do you feel like the number of people who understand this story, the sort of metaphorical school children in London, do you feel like more of them know the story today and are moved by the story?
I do. And of course, we don't discount the numerous books, novels, memoirs that Palestinians have been writing. They've been talking about their own stories. They've been painting their stories. They've been putting on plays, making films about these stories, and it's all had an effect. And I can see it. I can see it. The people who sympathize with Gaza and who have been out on demos and who are just wonderful, really wonderful people, they're not doing it because they've been reading up their history and their political science. They're doing it because it's got through to them. These are Palestinians, are human beings. They have feelings. They suffer. Yes, it's definitely true.
I lied earlier when I said I first became aware of your work when I heard about your latest book, One State. I actually realized that I was aware of your In Search Of book because of the story of the New York Times editor. And if you'll humor me, do you mind telling this story? Because it's so powerful. And I heard it unconnected to this book. There were so many people at the time who said, oh my God, I'm reading this book and this happens in it. And I don't want to spoil the story. So if you don't mind, I'd love for you to tell the story because it's so powerful.
Well, the story, by the way, is recounted in a second memoir, not In Search of Fatima, but in a memoir called Reverting, which I wrote a few years after In Search of Fatima. That's the story is in there.
Okay.
But I'll tell you what it is. I was in Palestine in 2005, and I was working for the Palestinian Authority. There's a long story behind that, which you can read in the memoir. Anyway, while I was there, I received an email from a very unlikely source, namely the New York Times bureau chief, who had got hold of my contact details and said that he believed he was living in an apartment on the top of my family home. And the reason he believed that, he read In Search of Fatima, he'd been reading it, and he recognized that the house that is described in there was the house that his section was built on top of. So he wrote, it was a friendly email. He said, I believe that this is your family home, and I'd like very much to invite you to come and see it, and perhaps that the family that lives in it now, he's friendly with them, etc. I couldn't resist, of course. So I went. I went to the house, indeed, it was the house, of course, and it was a man called Stephen Erlanger, who was the bureau chief at the time. Anyway, he entertained me in the apartment. Now, there was no apartment when we lived there. It was a villa. It's a one-story villa. Clearly, at some point, somebody had built an apartment on top of it, and apparently, as I found out later, that apartment was sold to the New York Times for their bureau chiefs from the early 1980s. So here is one of a string, and it was his turn, but he recognized where he was. So anyway, he invited me, and we sat and chatted in a friendly way. He was a typical Jewish New Yorker, cultivated, smooth, and a Zionist, of course. Anyway, so we talked, and he was as good as his word. The family who lived in it, who were also so-called liberal Zionists, they showed me around. And asked me to feel free to go around for what had been our home, which I did. And then he and I had a chat. He took photos of me, in the house, and so on. So then we had this chat. I said, tell me, you've read In Search of Fatima. you've been in touch with me, you see me, and this is indeed my home. And do you feel anything about this? He looked puzzled. I said, well, do you feel this is possibly rather strange that you should be here because I am not? If I were here, you wouldn't be here. You know the story now. How do you feel about Israel? And he went into such a tizzy. He said, well, he said, well, of course, that's in the past, and people always behave in specific ways in response to circumstances of the time. Waffle, waffle, waffle. He was clearly extremely uncomfortable. And I pressed the point. I said, you really need to ask yourself this question. Do you think it's right? Do you think it's right that you should be living here? And you've got me, I'm here, I'm telling you. We were here, this was our home. You don't feel anything. You don't feel anything. And it was no good at all. He became, I would say, he went into a panic. And he was only too happy for me to leave. So that's the story.
It's interesting because the idea of stolen land, I think for so many people sounds mystical. However, stolen property seems very modern and very easy to understand. I mean, stolen land is obviously what has happened, and stolen lives and stolen dreams and stolen life. But it's, in addition to that, it's clearly stolen property, which a 5-year-old could understand. How did you feel? Maybe you only felt puzzled, but did you feel rage? Did you feel sadness? What did you feel?
No, I felt angry. I felt sick. Because actually this man was perfectly intelligent enough. He knew bloody well what I was talking about. And he refused. You could see the barriers going up because, of course, he could not accommodate the cognitive dissonance between knowing what had happened and between his presence and his acceptance of a state which does this to people. So what does it mean? How does he live with himself? Well, the only way he does is by suppressing our side of the story. Doesn't want to think about it, doesn't want to talk about it. And also, he must, somewhere in the dim recesses of what might pass for his soul, he might have felt a stirring of a conscience. That's why he approached me.
That's what I want to get at.
Yeah.
Why did he?
I think so.
Is it he was looking for some sort of forgiveness?
Could be. I've seen it in Zionists many times. They want you, the victim, to absolve them of their crime. And it goes very deep with them. I've seen it in many Zionists. And I think he had a bit of that in him. And there was a sort of a feeling of, well, let me do something for you to recompense you. At least come and see your own home, and I can make that possible, that kind of thing. Yeah, something like that. Actually, I must tell you, and that's another subject, I remember at one point being very interested in what I call Zionist angst. That is, Zionists who are in some kind of discomfort about what they know to be wrong and what they cannot admit because they're emotionally tied to the idea of Israel. That must make life difficult for them. So I think to the point, as I say, of what I would call angst. And some of them, we know, went the whole way and gave up the Zionism in the end. The dissonance between the reality and their own clinging to some mythical idea about Israel became too great, and so they dropped the Israel business. And we know people, that very well-known people like this, people like Peter Beinart in the United States, who is really a splendid man, very clear-sighted, but was a Zionist. And there are many Zionists like this, not enough, unfortunately.
When you can take the long view and you can sort of extrapolate forward, whilst today maybe there are not enough former Zionists and far too many Zionists, do you feel that the rate of change is increasing and the quote unquote days are numbered for this political movement? Are we seeing the logical conclusion of it? Are enough people starting to realize that this at its core is a political ideology born out of hate and born out of exclusion and suppression?
I'd like to think so. I would like to think so. I don't know is the answer. What I have seen is that in Israel itself, the Israeli population itself, where we used to believe, or we think we knew, quite a few Israelis who were having second thoughts, who were not happy with their government or with the ideology or all that kind of thing. But in the Gaza war, I and many Palestinians have been pretty horrified by seeing the vast majority of Israel's population right behind the wall. And you've got to ask yourself, what does that mean? If all those people, over 90%, support the war, well, what does that mean? So it was a big shock. It was a bit depressing. Now, Jews on the outside, once who've already made the decision to leave Israel, ex-Israeli Jews, if you like, yes, I mean, I've noticed many more of them being active and many more are comrades and colleagues, but I cannot give an overall picture. I don't think it's clear yet.
Yeah. I want to turn to the premise of the book, One State. And maybe let me read the whole title so for folks who are looking to find it. The title is One State, the Only Democratic Future for Palestine - Israel. It came out on Pluto Press. Let me ask you a really basic question. Who do you think is more married to the promotion of a two-state solution? Folks who say that they are supporting Palestine or folks who say that they are supporting Israel?
An interesting question. Well, it can't be answered quite like that because people's motives are different. Those Palestinians who supported the two-state solution, I don't know what's happened now, many of them did so not out of a desire to preserve Israel, but because they thought that they would get something. The great fear amongst Palestinians is that we will lose Palestine altogether. And so the idea that you could hang on to even a corner of it was better than facing, the end of the Palestinian presence. That was the motivation behind a lot of Palestinians who supported the two-state solution. The two states on the Israeli side, I think, was really supported by Zionists, what I'm calling soft Zionists, people who, I said earlier, feel a bit badly about the Palestinians, don't think it's right, would like everything to settle down so that they can have a bit of their country back and the rest, that is the Jewish Israelis, can relax in whatever remains of Israel. So that's what, both those motivations, they're quite different.
Yeah. I want to talk about, to me, what I feel like is almost an obsession with this idea of the two-state solution from, I'll use your term, from soft Zionists, who use it almost like this olive branch. And you hear a lot of this coming out of halls of power in America and in the UK and in the EU. Do you think, in your estimation, that support is offered cynically? That people who say that they support the two-state solution in hallways of power are doing so cynically?
At official level, government level, so on, two things. It's a mixture of laziness and of being seen to be doing the right thing. None of these people have ever really looked at what the two-state solution actually means on the ground. Not one of them seems to have looked at a map and understood that the territory that they imagine will form the Palestinian state is full of Israeli colonies. They've not bothered to look at that, and they don't want to look at it because this is where the laziness comes in and where you look reasonable. It's to do with how do you present yourself as a Western government, let's say. You can present your by supporting the two-state solution. You can pretend that what you're telling people is that you absolutely preserve Israel. The same support for Israel continues, but you're doing something for the Palestinians, and that you're being fair and even-handed, and you do a bit for the Palestinians, and again, you do what you would like to do for the Israelis, and everybody is happy. Now, we know very well, as I said, a glance at the map shows you this is rubbish. And I mean, in logistical terms, it's rubbish. But actually, in any other terms, it's unacceptable. Why would you give the indigenous people 20% of their original land? Why would you do that? If you really want a two-state, okay, why don't you split it down the middle and give it 50-50? So the whole thing is riddled with hypocrisy, with mythology, with euphemisms and hypocrisy, really.
So when you write this book, or you go around and give talks and you speak to people, are there smart people? Let me try to be as direct as possible. Are there people that you respect intellectually that have a different opinion than you and are supporting anything but a one state? Can a smart person come to a different conclusion?
Good question. I'm afraid I don't think so. You see, a person can be smart, but can not want to think about something. They can want to avoid awkward questions that they need to answer. So those sorts of reasons would apply for somebody who's smart. But anybody who's really intelligent and is not mentally lazy will not support the two-state solution idea for a second, because they know very well it's not doable. Now, the other thing, by the way, about all this is that Israel itself has just passed a resolution in its own parliament rejecting the idea of two states, rejecting a Palestinian state. Well, why does anybody take any notice of that? I mean, Israel is the other side of this agreement, isn't it?
Yeah.
And one side doesn't want it at all. So why are people talking about it? Just on that basis.
Yeah. So let's say you could control events for the next 20 years within some sort of reason and without rolling back the clock. And everything goes as you are proposing it should go. What does daily life look like, and what does governance look like in the land between the river and the sea?
Well, first of all, one looks at the demographic reality. You have to start from there. And the demographic reality shows you that in the territory between the river and the sea, there are two communities of roughly equal size. And one community is Palestinian Arab, the other community is Israeli Jewish. That is the reality. These people are there. Now, on the basis of the fact that nobody is going away, nobody is leaving, those communities are staying. So, from my point of view, the starting point, and the starting point for anybody with a grain of intelligence, should be, how can we find a way, what is the way in which these two communities can live together peacefully? Nobody's getting rid of anybody, I repeat, and therefore a formula has to be found in which both sides can live together in a reasonable way. Now, if you look at it like that, the conclusions seem to me to be obvious. There is only one way, and that is in a democracy in which each person is a citizen, not a Jew, and not an Arab, and not a Muslim, and not any of those. They're a citizen, and irrespective of their ethnicity, their creed, etc. So once you do that, and you have a democracy, so it represents people, then people have a democratic parliament, and they try to live together. Now, that is not the same as saying there'll be no problems and that everybody will love this. No, I understand that very well. But we need to be clear, that is the starting point of a discussion. There isn't another way. You cannot partition that territory and do it in a way that satisfies both parties. Both parties want the whole country. So why would you make both of them unhappy? And you cannot expel one side or the other. That's just not going to happen. Therefore, what have you got? What have you got left? And so really, in a way, it's only the only sensible way forward. Now, I would then go on to say that in terms of your question, how would it feel like, what would happen? Well, it won't be easy. That is for certain. That's for certain. People have to be aware of that. They've got to be prepared. There's a lot of hatred and loathing on both sides, and you can understand it. So it's no good imagining they're all going to be falling in love. Of course not. What they'll have to do is to get along in the way under the law. Under the law. That's why the law is so important. And there'll be, I have no doubt, frictions, skirmishes, hatreds, all kinds of things. But in the end, people eventually settle down and accept, grudgingly or otherwise, what the situation is. Now, for Jewish Israelis, who will no longer be Israelis, of course, the idea that they would have to live together in equality with people they despise, that is the Palestinians, they look down on, it's really tough. And I suspect quite a few of them, those who can, will leave. That's what I think actually in practice will happen. They will leave, leaving the impoverished or very religious Jews or people who really got nowhere to go. And on the Palestinian side, it's very tough for them to accept inequality. They're murderers, and the people who usurp their country and kill their children. Very difficult. So it can be very hard. And there's no point pretending it would be otherwise. I've often said, in answer to questions like this, the problem really is that Israel should never have been created. That is the truth. Having been created, it's been a dreadful problem and a burden for the people of the region, and particularly the Palestinians. So there is no easy answer to something that's been imposed. So it's like saying everybody wanted Israel to happen, oh, but it didn't work out, what shall we do? It's not true. Nobody in the region wanted Israel. It's been imposed by force, by coercion, by power politics, by Western support. It's really a dreadful story, this. And, you know, the poor Palestinians who are the victims have to be able to find a way out of this because they love their country.
Yeah. You said something interesting. You said, of course, they won't be Israelis. And words matter, names matter, ideas matter. I intentionally asked you about what will this daily life be for the land between the river and the sea. In your estimation, if this is the logical conclusion, like there's only one way to go, which is eventually a one-state solution because, in the words of many people, there's a one-state reality. This is already the truth. It's not a democracy and it's not a just place. There's enormous amounts of injustice, but there is a reality of there's only one state essentially right now. What do you think this place will be called?
Well, I have no doubt at all about it. It's called Palestine. And there's really good reason for that, because it was Palestine until 76 years ago. So a name, Palestine, which has endured for this country for 4,000 years, is not going to be replaced by a state that's been imposed and is invented a name for itself, and it calls itself, whether Israel or whatever else, is not acceptable. It's not right. It's not proper. The only proper answer is that it reverts to being Palestine. That's how people have to think of it. It's not being renamed or something. It reverts, that's all, to what it was nearly 76 years ago, or under a century. And after all, when the Crusaders turned up all those years ago, all those centuries ago, and renamed all kinds of things, when they went, everything reverted back to what it was. So this is the same.
I want to ask you what you're working on right now, and if you feel, albeit heartbroken, if you feel more hopeful about the prospect of justice in Palestine today versus 2-3 years ago when you were working on this book.
Honestly, I can't answer you, and I tell you why. I speak to many Palestinians, and they very much have the view that they are optimistic. They think that in the long term, this is all going to collapse. The whole system of Israel and Western support, etc., is going to collapse. And they may well be right. I mean, my problem is that I'm so conscious of the damage that this imposed state has done so far and will do. If it's possibly dying, I don't know. But in its death throes, it will throw out more death and destruction. And it's very difficult to anticipate what would happen after that. So I find it quite difficult to look that far ahead. Now, it doesn't mean that I don't think this will ever go right. I'm not saying that at all. I suppose what I'm very much conscious of is the harm this entity has done, how evil, it really is evil. I have to use strong language like this. It is utterly evil. It's an evil entity which has done nothing but harm to the people of the region and, of course, most particularly the Palestinians.
The last question I'll ask you is, if you were giving advice to somebody, let's say somebody in their 20s, who says to you, I feel as though I'm surrounded by people who don't quite understand the issue, and the degree to which they understand it lands them in a slight sympathy towards Zionism. And they asked you for a playbook. They said, what is the 1, 2, 3? What is the manual for getting people to release that that bias and reset their understanding towards anti-Zionism, towards justice? What would you say the right way of doing that is?
Well, I would, first of all, I would be active. I think talking has not, doesn't achieve very much. It's when people are active, when they act, when they do things, this has a lot of meaning. As, for example, the demonstrations, the vocal opposition to what Israel is doing has been very effective, more effective than sitting down and explaining to people and saying this is not good and it shouldn't be happening. So you go on acting, you go on being supportive of the Palestinians, and your only bit of advice to people like that, there's no point. I've never been able to change the mind of a Zionist. Really, I haven't. I think the thing that you have to do is to advise them in a nice way, and you say to them, you need to learn more. Why don't you talk to Palestinians? Why don't you read about how Palestinians feel? And then you'll start to get the picture. You'll start to get the idea. So do it like that. And by the way, I'm conscious that you had asked me a question I did not answer, which is what am I working on? Perhaps I should say, very unlike my record, a few years back, I wrote a novel, and although all my writing, as you're well aware, is on Israel-Palestine, but this novel is not. And I'm giving a sort of advance plug for this book, because a few years back, I remember feeling weary, so weary of fighting and that things were only getting worse for the Palestinians. So I took a leave of absence, if you understand. And I wrote a book, not about Palestine, but about Baghdad under the Abbasid Caliphate. So it's a historical novel, and you might well wonder what the hell is this got to do with anything, but I will explain very briefly. It's a historical novel, and it's set in 9th century Baghdad when the Islamic Empire was at its height, and a really very exciting period in Islamic history, and this book, this novel, should appear in September. It would have been published by then. I remember thinking that perhaps we ought to talk a little bit about Arab civilization, what the Arabs have actually contributed to civilization. It's not all about politics. It's not all about Palestine, Israel. There is a great world which the Arabs created and at one time was grand and splendid and was indeed unique in the world. And it was in that century that I set the story of Mojana. That's the name of the book.
Beautiful. Which you can pre-order now, actually. It's coming out in September. And Doctora, I have to say that I fully agree, which is why we're doing the work that we're doing. So you and I are thinking the same lines in terms of the power of curiosity and getting people to understand the broader picture and reframing the narrative about what this place was, what it is, and reimagining what it might be in the future with our actions and our contributions to that future. I have to thank you tremendously for not only joining us today, but your decades of work. I'm inspired by your resolve and the amount of work that you've done. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed talking to you. And I hope the things that I've said will find an echo in the viewers and listeners.
I hope so too.